Good day, good day. I do hope that you're doing well. We are continuing with our Bible reading lessons. This is day 150 of our Bible reading. We have read from the first half of the book of Esther. That is Esther chapters 1 to 5. It is an interesting story which is much better to read in one sitting from 1 to 10, all the 10 chapters, to just get the story as a whole. However, we have read the first half, which is chapters 1 to 5. I'll be giving you a few lessons from some of the highlighted verses, starting with a high level overview. Now, in chapter 1, we see Queen Vashti is removed from being queen after she had refused the king's command. She refused the king's command, and thus she was removed. This is King Xerxes, or also known as Ahasuerus. He's the one who's the father to Artaxerxes, and thus we are able to place the events of the book of Esther within the book of Ezra, because in the book of Ezra we already see Artaxerxes, who is the son to this Xerxes. So then, in chapter 2 of Esther, we see that there's a search of a new queen, and Esther, being a Jewish orphan, so she did not have her own biological parents anymore, she was raised by Mordecai. So this is introducing us to some of the key characters. So we have Mordecai, who was a guardian over Esther, and then he helps to arrange that she could hopefully be one of the chosen women. And then she was then the new queen. And what's also interesting here in this chapter is that Mordecai discovers an assassination plot against the king, and it is even recorded in the royal chronicles. So this is gonna help later on. So it's just a small insert, but it is going to help later on, as we shall see in this story, because Mordecai would have done something good for the king. Then in chapter 3, we see that Haman plots against the Jews. This is after Mordecai had refused to bow before Haman, because Haman was rising in power and Mordecai refuses to bow. And this is quite consistent with some of the Jews, as we see earlier on in the book of Daniel. Now, I say earlier on, even though we have not read the book of Daniel, because the events of the book of Daniel happened earlier than the events in this book of Esther that we are reading. The book of Daniel, of course, the events happened under the Babylonian Empire, and now we've even transitioned from Babylon to Persia, because Babylon had fallen and Persia became the new power in charge. And then we as we saw in the book of Daniel, that some of the Jews did refuse to bow, and this is something which is consistent about the Jews. They would not bow to other people because they know that they only bow to God alone. I find it quite interesting that today people still want to bow to other people, especially even when it's about bowing before pastors and so on, and going all excessive. Yes, let us honor the pastors, but be careful of excessive honor, because that in itself can lead to a form of worship, and we worship only God alone. So Haman plots to destroy all the Jews, and these lots which are being used, which are called Pur, and this leads to the name of the festival later on, and this was to select a date, and then he persuades the king to approve and decree. So there's a decree which is done here, and I'll speak more about decrees as well. And this decree was to kill all of the Jews, that they must be completely destroyed. And then in chapter 4, we see Mordecai. He urges Esther to do something about this. And initially she was afraid, but she did then eventually approach the king, because she was saying that, hey, but the king only wants people to approach him when he did request them to come. And then in chapter 5, we see that Esther does go through with it. She does approach the king and invites the king and Haman as well to a banquet. And this leads to Haman to have pride about it, to think that, oh, he's being favored, he's being invited to a banquet and so on. But this entire invitation is probably against him. Imagine what pride does, that one is even blind to the fact that he's being invited to something not for his favor, and is using that to celebrate. Now let us go into some of the highlighted verses and offer a few lessons. Now starting now with verse 4. So verse 4, perhaps to read it in context, Let me start from the middle of verse 3, which says, "The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and the governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days." I highlight this verse to show us that indeed the tables had turned. Initially, back we saw Solomon was great. People were traveling from far to come see his greatness, to come see his glory. But now this greatness is not in the hands of a king of Judah or a king of Israel, but it is in an outsider king. An outsider king is great, while those of Judah, those of the Israelites are serving under him. And all that was due to their own sin, all that was due to them disobeying God over and over and over again. And now the tables have turned. And by the way, this also shows us that those who are not of God can do great things, can become great. They can have riches. So let's not think that riches only belong to the children of God. Even those who are not children of God, we see how they have riches. Now let's move to verse 11. In verse 11, we see Queen Vashti refusing this when the king is asking her to come. It says in verse 11 to bring Queen Vashti before the king with a royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. So what's going on here is that the king, in his banquet, he has been showing the different greatness he has, the different riches he has, and that was not enough. It shows, by the way, that the things of the world are not enough, because he was still, it seems to me, he was not content. I must even show you my wife. You must even see that my wife is beautiful. And that is disrespect. Why is he treating his own wife with such disrespect, to say that she must come and be displayed as if she's equal in value with the other riches that he was displaying? And I think she was in a right. She was definitely in a right to refuse, even though this led to a downfall, because this was disrespect. You know, the things of this world, when people are outside God, there's never contentment. You know, you can have the riches, you can display the riches, you can display the cars and the bling and everything, and it's still not enough. You still feel empty. Now you want to display your own wife. And even that was not going to make him feel satisfied. So this is a sad thing to observe, that he wanted to treat his wife as an object. I think just to do with that, there's no contentment when you're outside of God. But at the same time, we should mention, because some people can read this in a weird way. You know, some people read the Bible out of context. Some people can read this and say, look at the Bible, it promotes women being used as objects. Queen Vashti was being brought before the king to be displayed and so on. But the context clearly shows here that this king, number one, is not even a king under God's people. But even if he was an Israelite king, the Bible would clearly say, but this was a king was not doing God's will. It describes how kings, even in Israel, were doing that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Bible gives us descriptions of the wrong things that people do. It doesn't say that the wrong things that people are doing are right. If you want to look at what is right, we need to hear, what did God say? What did Jesus say? Because some things are just descriptions of what these people did. And so we can read the Bible and understand that, no, this is a description. However, at the same time, God is working even within the wrong things that people are doing, because God is able to use anything for good for his own people. And we know that in this story, the removal of Queen Vashti after she had refused to be treated as an object would lead now to Esther coming into the picture. So God is able to use the things of unbelievers, the wrong things that they're doing, to the advantage of his people. He's God. You know, all things work together for the good. He's able to use these things, and he doesn't force the unbelievers to do wrong things, but when they do those wrong things, when they harden their hearts, is even able to continue harden their hearts, because they began themselves by being sinful and hardening their hearts. We see with Pharaoh the king how initially he was the one who was hardening his heart, his heart, and God was then going to use that to display his glory. Not so much that God arbitrarily just chose that, okay, I'm going to discipline Pharaoh. No, Pharaoh began in a sinful way. He began with a hardened heart. He began by doing all that was wrong, and then God took that and used it for his own glory. All right, let's move to the next chapter. So in chapter 2, we read in verse 11, it says, "And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her." So two things I want to mention. Number one, Mordecai, we can see that he was a good guardian, that he would every day want to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. You know, this was something of care. Like, even though he did arrange that she can go into this place, she wanted to learn. He wanted to learn about her state on a daily basis and what was happening to her. And it shows care. It shows care that it was not just, okay, I've given her into that place, now I'll come back after a month and see what's happening. It was every day. And we can learn something here from Mordecai about caring for those entrusted in our care. That do we have concern over them, whether it's our children or wherever the context may be, that we should have a concern over what's happening in the lives of those under our care. Now, the second thing I want to mention, and again, it's on not just this verse, but on the passage thus far, is that some people might also speak against that Mordecai sold this child, this poor girl, into this place. They could even use the language of, he pimped her to become a queen to even an unbeliever of a king. And then once again we go back to, this was a description of what happened. It's not what the Bible was condoning to happen. It's not what the Bible is saying that this is how things must be done. And thus reading context is quite important. In fact, the biggest thing that we should learn as we are reading the Bible is to separate between prescription and description. Because prescription is what the Bible is prescribing or commanding or instructing to say this is how you must do things. And description is where the Bible is only describing what did happen. And once again, the descriptions of things that happened, God is still able to use it for his purposes, for his glory. And we can see even in this that God is going to use it towards his glory. Now let us go to chapter 3. All right, so actually I did not highlight any verse in chapter 3, as it was just a continuation of this story. And then in chapter 4, I read verse 3, it says, "And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes." So here we can see that the decree was out. And this decree led to the people to have a great mourning among the Jews. So this is a great cry among the Jews. And again, we see that fasting was a result of something which was happening. It was not something which people were just planning to say, okay, I think this week is a good day to fast. No, it was a deep cry. They were truly crying. They were weeping. Like, fasting was associated with weeping and crying. And it was coming straight from what the people were going through. And they even put on sackcloth and ashes. And this was to them the fast that took place. Why? Because of the decree which was going to have all the Jews killed. And what was the source of this? What had led to this to happen? Because Mordecai had refused to bow to Haman. And then when we read in verse 14, it says, this is Mordecai speaking to Esther, "If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So here we see the arguments that Mordecai is putting forth, and one thing that it's quite interesting here is when Mordecai says, "If you keep silent, relief and deliverance will rise from another place." I believe that this was faith in Mordecai, because God would not have his people, the entire remnant of his people, wiped from the face of the earth. And thus he would say that, look, deliverance would rise from another place. It could be quite true that when we as well might refuse to do the work that we're being called to do, God, where he wants his purposes to be fulfilled, might raise other leaders to do it, raise other people to do it, because the purposes of God should be fulfilled nonetheless. But of course, we do see how God would still graciously and patiently, because he's slow to anger and he's patient, would still want to work with those who want to run away from the work. We're going to read about Jonah, who also ran away from the work. And here Mordecai says, but you and your father's house will perish. And this shows that while you might refuse to do the work that God might be calling you to do, God would still ensure that his purposes, his plans are coming to pass. But you yourself, because you have refused, then there can be a sense of perishing. And this word perish, of course, it could literally mean dying, but I mean, what does father's house mean? If she did not even have a parents anymore, she was an orphan. But it could also speak to just remaining unknown, like a legacy is perishing, and thus it carries a context perhaps beyond just physical death, right? And then he says that who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And for me, this highlights something quite interesting, that there is a place and a time that God has placed you at, and there is something that God can do right where you are. Sometimes people want to first hear that maybe I must move to a certain country, maybe I must go far away, maybe he's calling me to go there, and maybe that might be true. But right where you are, for such a time as this, for me tells me that God can use your current circumstances, your current location, whatever circumstances you are in, whether it's a circumstance of being unemployed, or there's a circumstance of being in a certain location, whatever the circumstance you are in, God can use it for such a time. Such a time as this, it means that you are in a specific circumstance which is unique to you, and God can use it for his glory, for his purposes. And that means don't undermine where you are and where you are in life, whether it's in terms of location, whatever is it that you're currently busy with, God is able to use it for his purposes. And what it means on our side, we need to be open to God using us, right? Verse 16, this is Esther replying, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young woman will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." That's verse 16. So, a few things here to note. Number one is that the fasting which is being declared here is not necessarily one which is a response to a situation. It's one where a fast is being declared in preparation of something which is coming ahead. She wants to prepare for the fact that she's going to go before a king which is against the law. And again, this means that we cannot put fasting in only one view. We can see that, hang on, A person can be about to do something and fast before God and say, God, in 5 days' time, this is going to happen. And you're praying, you're seeking God for that. There's nothing wrong with that. We do note, however, that for the most part, it was something which was a reaction to what was the deepest cry of people's hearts, whether they are fasting because they are mourning over their own sin in terms of repentance, or in terms of they're crying for safety and for deliverance from God. And in this case, we can see that this is future looking, where she's asking that people fast on her behalf, hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink. So it was a dry fast, it appears. Again, this is not meant for us to copy this as a formula. Right? Our relationship with God must not be formula based, or based on, okay, we saw Esther do it, let's also do it. The Esther fast. I wonder if people have the Esther fast. I know of the Daniel fast, which I still don't understand. We'll get into that when we get in the book of Daniel. So we don't need to copy things as they are. We need to realize that some of these stories are unique in themselves, right? The book of Esther is a unique story as well. So that's the first point to highlight, that fasting can be something that people declare and do as a way to seek God, to seek God's protection. We saw when they were traveling as well how they sought God's protection. And then the second point I want to show is that she goes on to say, I and my young women will also fast, meaning that she included herself. She did not say that you guys fast for me while I, the queen, am eating the queen's food. No, she also included herself in this. So we can learn here that we too should be a part of what we are asking people to do. If you are declaring a fast, people are fasting for you, why can't you also be fasting as well yourself? So this is a leadership by example, in a sense, that I will also do it. I will not just tell people to do it. And I'm reminded of what Jesus says about the Pharisees. He says that they love to lay burdens on others, but they themselves do not even lift a finger. They themselves do not do it. And I like what he says here at the end. If I perish, I perish. This is how every believer should be. That we are willing to serve God in every way, how he shows us in the scriptures. And if I perish, I perish. As long as at the end of the day, I was serving the Lord. And this does not mean let's look out to force ourselves to perish. No, it's not a suicidal idea. It's a practical idea that you see this is where you want God. This is what God is saying you should do. This is where God is sending you. And Esther was not wanting to even do this to begin with. If there was no need for her to go before the king, and there was no this situation that was taking place, she was not gonna disobey the law. It says here, though it is against the law, she was not gonna do this and say, okay, I'm Esther, I'm disobeying the law just for fun. If I perish, I perish. There was a serious need behind it. So even as we are serving God, we can't just put ourselves in dangerous situations when there was no serious need for it. So we can still apply the wisdom here to say, hang on, is this thing that I'm about to do because is it related to what God said should happen? Is there another way to approach it? And for Esther and this story, we can see that the context, it had to be done, or else the entire race of people was going to be killed. All right, let's go to the last chapter, chapter 5, where we see Esther does go before, she goes before the king. And I just want to read verse 9, where it has been arranged now that there's this banquet that is going to take place. So just to remind you of the banquet, verse 8 says, if I found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. And then verse 9 says, and Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. So he's so joyful and glad of heart. And then it continues, says, but when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, he neither rose nor trembled before him. He was filled with wrath against Mordecai. It's a very funny reading. And then verse 10 says, nevertheless, Haman restrained himself. I suppose he's restraining himself because he's been invited to go before the king and queen in a banquet. So he's joyful and glad in heart, and yet Mordecai does not rise nor tremble, and now he's filled with wrath. Imagine being filled with anger just because of one man. And I know the context here is a little bit the other way around, because Haman was an evil man to start with. But imagine you're joyful. Let's just forget for a second that Haman was a bad guy. But imagine you're joyful and glad in heart. And just one person, just because one person did not respect you or did not bow to you, or just because one person ignored you, must that fill you with anger? So you can see, of course, this is a description of Haman's character and who he was. And he did restrain himself, at least here. Why? Because of the good which was about to happen to him the next day. Well, he thinks it's the good which was about to happen, but that's not the case. So here is just a small encouragement for us to have what we can call emotional intelligence, to say that if you are joyful and glad of heart, don't let one person take that away from you. Especially don't let an enemy take it away from you. And again, I'm recognizing that Haman was a bad guy and Mordecai was a good guy. But in actual fact, Haman was joyful and glad of heart. And in actual fact, Mordecai was technically his enemy. Don't let people who are you see as your enemy or you see as your adversaries to take away the joy that you might have in your heart just because they did not smile at you. No, you can keep your joy, keep your peace. Don't be filled with anger like Haman was. I think Haman, in everything that he was doing, from the very beginning, not being bowed before, up to this point, it was all unnecessary. He was seeking excessive worship. He was seeking to be honored. It shows that indeed pride kills. Pride comes before the fall. So those are some of the lessons that we can pick up from Esther in the first half, chapters 1 to 5. May God indeed bless you as we continue reading. Amen.